So now we're going to create what's called a welt seam. Where would you see a welt seam? Well, on your blue jeans, the inseam is a welt seam that's top stitched. You're going to see it any place where you want to press the seam and then secure it to the surface by adding an extra row of stitching. So we're going to do a little welt seam. So now if you look at the back side of the fabric, you can see that I've pressed both seams in one direction. We're not pressing it open, we're pressing it over this way. You might use this on something maybe that's going to be lined where you don't see the seam on the inside, maybe in a curtain, in a garment where you might want to top stitch the side seam flat. So on the right side, you can see that everything's pressed really smooth. So I want to now sew a line on the outside about maybe 3/8 or a ½ inch over from the seam. So you want to sew it on the side where the seam allowance is. So on my sewing machine, I'm going to want to, I like to put it with the seam going to the left. And then I'm going to put my presser foot so that it's on the left side of that seam. And I'm going to sew a line, securing all together. The best thing I can tell you is just sort of like try to look at the distance between your seam and your presser foot. I'm going to make it about 1/8 of an inch, and I'm going to try to do this as straight as possible. Again, I wanted you to use dark thread here so that when you photograph your sample, I can see and evaluate like where your strengths and weaknesses are, what things do we need to work on. So I'm going to stitch forward. And sometimes if it's top stitching, you would use a heavier weight fabric that's more decorative. I mean, a heavier weight thread. I'm going to actually lengthen my stitch length here to 4 because I don't want it to look really tightly stitched. I want the threads to lay on the surface. So I'm going to stitch it, back stitch again at the beginning and the end, and just kind of guide it so that it stays as straight as possible. You might have to do it more than once to get the feel of how to try to get it straight. I'm going to support it at the back as this is coming to the end. I don't want it to all of a sudden curve and have a weird looking end. So again, I'm going to back stitch here, and now there's my welt seam. Take it out, clean up the thread. Most of the time you would be either using a contrasting thread because you're making a design statement, or if it's just that you're making the seam for it to be more secure, you might use matching threads. So on the outside, you can see that this is where my seam is, and then my seam allowance is held in that stitching. And then this is what it looks like on the back. So you can see that I didn't go off of the seam allowance, and I didn't go too close to the edge. I've got a nice even double line there. So this is your welt sample. Mark it and add it to your book.